In a busy town, there was an old woman who owned a small bakery. Her name was Mrs. Emma, and everyone in town knew her. Mrs. Emma had been baking for many years, and her cakes were famous all over the town. Her bakery was always full of the sweet smell of fresh cakes and cookies. People loved to visit her bakery because her cakes were different from any other cakes. They were soft, sweet, and always baked with love. Every morning, Mrs. Emma woke up early, even before the sun rose. She would put on her apron and start baking. She made many different cakes: chocolate cakes, vanilla cakes, fruit cakes, and her most special cake, the Golden Dream Cake. This cake was her secret recipe, and no one knew how she made it. People from all over the town would come just to taste it. The bakery was always full of customers. Some came to buy a cake for a birthday, some for a party, and some just wanted a small piece to enjoy with their tea. Mrs. Emma was always smiling and happy to serve them. She knew all her customers by name and often gave free cookies to the children who visited her bakery. One day, a young boy named Tom came into the bakery. He had heard from his friends about the famous Golden Dream Cake and wanted to try it. Tom did not have much money, but he saved up for a whole week just to buy a small piece. He walked into the bakery and stood in line waiting his turn. When it was his turn, Tom looked up at Mrs. Emma and said, "I would like a piece of the Golden Dream Cake, please." Mrs. Emma smiled at him. "Of course, young man," she said, cutting a small piece of the cake and wrapping it carefully. "That will be just enough for you to enjoy." Tom paid for the cake and walked out of the bakery with a big smile. He took a bite as soon as he was outside, as his eyes lit up. The cake was soft, sweet, and had a taste he had never had before. It was like eating a cloud, and it melted in his mouth. Tom couldn't believe how delicious it was. The next day, Tom went back to the bakery. This time, he didn't come to buy a cake. He went up to Mrs. Emma and said, "Your cake was so delicious. I want to learn how to bake cakes like you. Can you teach me?" Mrs. Emma looked at the boy and thought for a moment. "Baking cakes is not just about the recipe, my boy. It's about baking with your heart. If you want to learn, you have to promise me one thing." Tom said, "What is it?" "You must promise to always bake with love. That's the real secret to making delicious cakes." Tom promised, and Mrs. Emma agreed to teach him. The next morning, Tom arrived at the bakery before the sun was up. Mrs. Emma gave him an apron and showed him how to measure the flour, sugar, and butter. She taught him how to mix the ingredients slowly and carefully. She told him about the importance of patience when baking. For many weeks, Tom came to the bakery every morning. He practiced baking with Mrs. Emma, learning everything she knew. Slowly, he became better and better at baking. Mrs. Emma was proud of him. One day, after many lessons, Tom baked his first Golden Dream Cake. Mrs. Emma tasted the cake and smiled. "You did it, Tom," she said. "Your cake is perfect. It tastes just like mine." Tom was so happy he had learned how to bake the famous cake. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Emma. I will never forget what you have taught me." As time went by, Tom continued to visit the bakery, helping Mrs. Emma with the baking. The people in the town noticed that the cakes were still as delicious as ever, even when Tom made them. They were happy to see that Mrs. Emma had a helper. One day, Mrs. Emma grew very tired. She had worked in the bakery for many years, and now it was time for her to rest. She called Tom to her side and said, Tom, I am too old to run the bakery now. I want you to take over. You have learned everything I know, and you bake with love. Tom was surprised. But I am not as good as you, he said. Mrs. Emma smiled kindly. You are just as good, Tom. You put your heart into every cake, and that's why the cakes are so special. The bakery is yours now. Tom was sad to see Mrs. Emma retire, but he knew it was time for him to take care of the bakery. He promised to continue baking with love, just like she had taught him. From that day on, Tom ran the bakery. He made all the delicious cakes that the town loved, including the famous Golden Dream cake. The people in the town still came to the bakery every day. They missed seeing Mrs. Emma behind the counter, but they were happy to see that Tom had kept her traditions alive. The bakery stayed as warm and inviting as it had always been. Years went by and Tom became known as the best baker in town. But he never forgot who had taught him. Every time he baked a cake, he remembered Mrs. Emma and the lessons she had taught him to be patient, kind, and always bake with love. One evening, as Tom was closing the bakery, a little girl walked in. She looked up at Tom and said, I heard your cakes are the best in town. Can you teach me how to bake like you? Tom smiled just as Mrs. Emma had smiled at him many years ago. Come back tomorrow morning, I'll teach you, he said. And so the story continued. The bakery was not just a place to buy cakes, it was a place where love and kindness were shared, passed down from one generation to the next.